All right, I'm going to continue on now talking about these early colonies. All right, so we have a little bit of part two here. So the colonies get set up. What happens? All right, we talked about self-rule being one of the big things that we see. The British were used to the representative governments, and they bring those with them, and they bring the ideas from it. So we see the beginning of self-rule take place. That's important because this is going to be a key factor in leading to revolution when we get into the 1770s. Jamestown would establish the first representative government with the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1619. At Plymouth, they had what was called the Mayflower Compact in 1620, which pretty much allowed a right to vote and, again, having a contract to set up a style of so that they had a government to where people would be treated the way they wanted to be treated. And in Massachusetts Bay, all freemen were allowed to vote for governor, assistant, and representative assembly. And so those are things that we see. Now, it wasn't the democracy that we now know. There were definite limits. Not everybody had the ability to vote. Landless people didn't. Farmers, slaves, indentured servants, they didn't have any of those rights. Also, many colonies ruled autocratically. We're talking about a lot of royal colonies where the king gave the governors the authority, and they ruled with the power of the king behind them, or the proprietary colonies had financial backers in England. That's who they were answering to. Those are the ones that they were getting their money from, and so they're gonna pay attention to the people who are paying them. And so not everybody was treated fairly, and what we start to see is a social class distinctions start to take place between wealth and poor, and the wealthy and the non-wealthy. We also see slavery, and we see mistreatment of the American Indians as well. So there was not equality in that sense either. All right, so let's move on to some more colonies. We know that there's more than just Virginia and Massachusetts. So we take a look. You get the establishment of the Chesapeake Colony. The Virginia colony was a very, very big colony. So King Charles I decided to divide it up, and he established Maryland. Maryland would be in charge, it would be a royal charter, would be put in charge of, as a proprietary colony. It was the first proprietary colony given to George Calvert. He would later change his name to Lord Baltimore. And the big thing about Calvert that stands out that's different is he was Catholic. And so Maryland would first be established with a sense of toleration towards all Christians, not necessarily Muslims or Jews, but when you compare it to Massachusetts, with both Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, they weren't very tolerant. Even though they went for religious freedom, they went to practice their religion, and they didn't really want outside religions. Maryland was going to be more accepting of people of different Christian faiths. So whether you were, being a Catholic would be okay. They actually passed something called the Tolerations Act in 1649. Now this would later get revoked when the Protestants would win a pre-Civil War and they would take over. But the establishment of toleration was there, and Maryland was always be a little bit more tolerant than some of the other colonies when it comes to religious. The big thing about the Chesapeake, so when we talk about the Chesapeake region, we're mainly talking about Maryland and Virginia. So now we talk about those colonies as a whole, that region. Economically, they were based off tobacco. Tobacco was the bread. The American tobacco flourished. It sold really well in Europe, and it was profitable. So there was plenty of trade, plenty of land also in these regions. Why? Because they'd either trade with the Indians or just the pure taking of the land from the Indians. One of the problems with the Chesapeake region, though, is that they had a major labor shortage. It was swampy. We talked about that before. The death rate was high. They had food shortages. You're not going to eat tobacco. And battles with the Indians. They didn't necessarily get along with all the Indian tribes. So the result is you have a slow population growth. So they came up with some answers to try to fix this. How can we get people to come to this land? And they do this by trying to get people to come over from England. You have the ideas of indentured servants. You have something called the headright system. And then, of course, slavery would be ways that they could bring over that labor force to work in these tobacco fields. Another problem would hit the Chesapeake area, though. Because you have the market flooded with new tobacco, the prices dropped. And that's a problem for the landowning farmers as well. So there was definitely some struggles along the way. Even though tobacco was in high demand in Europe, they really drastically increased the supply. So the low tobacco prices also did not help them. Eventually what we start to see are the small farmers start to struggle, and so we're going to focus it back on Virginia again. Virginia farmers you start to see this class distinction develop. Small farmers would get angry in Virginia. There would be issues dealing with poverty. Let me restate that. There would be issues dealing with the farmers. We see class differences take place as their land would become. They would start to have issues with their land. Pardon me as I look at my notes a little bit. One of these examples would be something called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a farmer, and he was not happy. He was on the western edge. He's on the frontier, so he was more in contact with the natives than what was going on. Bacon, as well as others, didn't really like some of the economic and political controls that were taking place in Virginia. So they raised a little heck and they took over. And even though it wasn't necessarily long-term successful, it definitely pointed out the issues of class differences, and it also pointed out some colonial resistance that was taking place. And so eventually Bacon died, and then his little resurrection kind of fell apart. But it did set the stage for some of these problems that would continue well into the 18th century. And so those are some of the issues we have.